Let's be very clear, before we even start. Enforcing integration was not complicated. It wasn't legally confusing. It wasn't ambiguous. After Brown v. Board of Education, after federal court orders, after Supreme Court rulings, the law was settled. Segregation was illegal. Full stop. So when Southern sheriffs, police chiefs, and local law enforcement officials refused to enforce integration, they weren't standing on principle. They weren't confused. They weren't overwhelmed. They were scared. Scared of white mobs. Scared of losing social standing. Scared of being treated the way they had spent their careers treating black people. And instead of doing their jobs, they folded like lawn chairs and tried to disappear quietly, hoping history wouldn't notice. Unfortunately for them, history has a long memory and a very petty streak. Take Birmingham, Alabama, where Bull Connor made cowardice loud. Connor was the city's public safety commissioner, which meant police and fire departments answered to him. He loved law and order the way bullies love rules they don't have to follow. When federal courts ordered integration, Connor didn't suddenly struggle with the Constitution. He understood it just fine. He simply decided it didn't apply to black people. Instead of enforcing the law, he unleashed police dogs on children and blasted peaceful protesters with fire hoses, then acted shocked when the entire world saw exactly what he was. And when courts finally stripped him of authority, Connor didn't resign in dignity. He clung to power, cried fraud, and had to be forcibly removed. This wasn't resistance. This was a grown man throwing a segregationist tantrum because equality meant he couldn't terrorize people with impunity anymore. Then there's Selma, Alabama, and Sheriff Jim Clark, a man who treated the badge like a membership card to white supremacy. Clark wasn't subtle. He openly aligned himself with segregationists, deputized violent civilians, and treated federal voting rights law like a personal insult. When black citizens tried to register to vote, Clark met them with clubs and jail cells. When courts told him to stop, he stalled. When national attention showed up, he doubled down. And when federal authorities finally stepped in, Clark's authority evaporated instantly. He didn't resign because he believed in anything. He became irrelevant because he couldn't enforce racism without consequences anymore. History doesn't remember him as tough. It remembers him as cruel, small, and afraid of a fair fight. Move over to Little Rock, Arkansas, where cowardice wore a quieter uniform. Everyone remembers Governor Orval Forbes standing in the schoolhouse door, but local law enforcement deserves their own chapter of shame. The Little Rock Police Department knew exactly what their job was after Brown. Protect the Little Rock 9. Enforce the law. Keep children safe. Instead, they stood around while white mobs screamed at teenagers because apparently confronting angry white adults was just too much to ask. Their refusal forced President Eisenhower to send in the 101st Airborne. Think about that. The United States Army had to escort children to school because local sheriffs and police officers decided neutrality was more comfortable than courage. That's not law enforcement. That's abdication with a badge. Mississippi didn't just flirt with cowardice, it institutionalized it. Governor Ross Barnett openly encouraged defiance of integration, and local sheriffs happily followed his lead. When James Meredith enrolled at the University of Mississippi, sheriffs and police didn't enforce court orders. They withdrew. They stalled. They allowed mobs to gather and violence to escalate. Federal marshals were beaten while local law enforcement watched. 2 people died. Hundreds were injured. And when federal forces finally took control, Mississippi officials pretended their hands were clean. They weren't. This wasn't confusion. This was coordinated abandonment. These men didn't fail the law accidentally. They chose white approval over public safety and called it tradition. In New Orleans, Louisiana, cowardice showed up as indifference. When 6-year-old Ruby Bridges integrated William Frantz Elementary School, local law enforcement conveniently forgot how to do their jobs. They didn't escort her. They didn't disperse mobs. They didn't protect a child walking into a school building. Federal marshals had to do what local sheriffs refused to do. These were the same departments that enforced curfews, traffic laws, and petty ordinances with enthusiasm. But protecting a black child, suddenly that was someone else's responsibility. That's not neutrality. That's moral collapse with a pension plan. Then there's Prince Edward County, Virginia, where sheriffs perfected the art of enforcement by omission. Rather than integrate public schools, the county shut them down entirely for 5 years. White families created private academies. Black children were left with nothing, and local sheriffs enforced this arrangement without objection. No protests, no resignations, no concern for the law. They upheld apartheid by doing absolutely nothing and called it governance. History doesn't struggle to label this. It was compliance, pure and simple. Across Georgia, places like Albany showed another flavor of cowardice, bureaucratic obstruction. Albany police didn't resign en masse. They didn't openly defy courts. They arrested protesters instead of enforcing desegregation orders. They filled jails instead of complying with the law. When courts ruled against them, they adjusted tactics just enough to delay progress. This wasn't confusion. It was strategy. Delay until attention faded. Delay until exhaustion set in. Delay until black citizens were blamed for demanding rights. They quit their duty without ever quitting their jobs. In suburban Birmingham and across parts of the Deep South, some sheriffs chose the quietest exit possible. They resigned suddenly, cited health issues, claimed personal reasons. Anything but admitting the truth. Enforcing integration meant standing up to white voters, and they didn't have the backbone for it. These were men who had no problem enforcing segregation, no problem enforcing violence, no problem enforcing humiliation, but enforcing equality. That was a bridge too far. So they stepped aside and hoped no one would connect the dots. We did. Florida's Panhandle offered another case study in strategic cowardice. Sheriffs there didn't always resign. They stalled, ignored court orders, delegated responsibility downward, pretended federal rulings didn't require urgency. This was racism, disguised as paperwork. They knew federal intervention was coming and chose to wait it out, hoping the heat would land somewhere else. Silence became their weapon. History calls that obstruction, not professionalism. And here's the pattern that ties all of this together. These men loved authority when it flowed downward. They loved power when it harmed black people. They loved the law when it justified violence and control. But the moment enforcing the law required protecting black citizens, confronting white mobs, or risking social backlash, they folded. Some resigned. Some stalled. Some hid. Some were removed. None rose to the moment. They didn't fail because integration was difficult. They failed because justice required courage, and courage was in short supply. Now here's the part that never gets said out loud. This cowardice didn't just delay integration. It reshaped policing for generations. These departments learned a lesson. If you wait long enough, if you stall politely, if you refuse quietly, someone else will carry the moral burden for you. Federal marshals, federal judges, federal troops, and that lesson carried forward. That's why just following orders and local discretion became shields instead of responsibilities. The blueprint for modern selective enforcement was drawn right here, in these moments of retreat disguised as professionalism. And let's not pretend this behavior disappeared. It evolved. The same instincts that told sheriffs to quit rather than protect black children are the instincts that later justified ignoring civil rights violations, slow-walking investigations, and closing ranks when accountability showed up. The uniforms changed. The language softened. The math stayed the same. Protect hierarchy. Avoid consequence. Let someone else deal with the fallout. Cowardice doesn't retire. It just learns new paperwork. So no, these men don't deserve footnotes filled with excuses. They don't get framed as products of their time. Plenty of people lived in that same time and chose differently. Courage existed. They just didn't have it. They had badges, titles, and authority, and when the moment came to use them for justice, they opted out. Quietly, conveniently, forever recorded. And this is why history matters when people talk about law enforcement today. Because when someone says, "That's not who we are," this chapter says otherwise. When someone says, "The law will protect you," this chapter raises an eyebrow. And when someone says progress happens naturally, this chapter laughs out loud. Progress happened because cowards were overridden, removed, or rendered powerless by people who refused to wait. That's the story. No edits, no soft lighting, just cause and effect. And if you want history told with honesty instead of comfort, follow Marcus Ferrell live.